They were saying things like, because they are supportive of sex work, and they being the, feminist academics, they're supportive of sex work, then there's not really space to discuss human trafficking. And so they would fully have, guest presenters saying human trafficking doesn't exist. They were just really pushing ideas so far to the extreme that it was really, really disheartening to be sitting in a class being taught that human trafficking doesn't exist.
Lies.
It doesn't
lies.
exist.
Those are lies.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's because it's the ideology, right? So
yeah,
I left, I think, ironically, struggling to call myself a feminist. And really, now if I use that term, I say I'm a traditional feminist. Because I think there is something within the feminist movement that really was responding to injustice and is worth preserving. But in terms of where it's gone, it really is heartbreaking. If a man can walk away from responsibility, if he doesn't have to stay and take care of a child, I want to be able to as well. And what's fascinating, though, Tammy, is that now we have almost the same conversation, but inverted.
Hi, Lia.
Hi.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. Good to see you, too.
I'm pretty excited about our conversation.
Good. I'm excited too.
We met just a few weeks ago at the George Jonas Gala event.
Yes.
Freedom Award event.
Yes.
And I don't know how I got the bravery to ask you, but anyway, I did. I asked you if you'd come on my podcast, and you said yes. So thank you very much.
I'm flattered. A number of people in my community are all very excited to hear how it goes. Many of us are big fans. So yes.
Well, let's get started then. First of all, I'd like you to introduce yourself and just tell people what you do, how long you've been doing it for.
Well, my name's Lia Milousis. I am a lawyer. I specialize in constitutional law, administrative law, human rights law, and family law. And I specialize in a relatively loose term. I'm a young lawyer. I've been a lawyer for about 2 and a bit years now, so still learning. My academic background is in political science and women's studies. So I studied at the University of Ottawa in the Feminist and Gender Studies faculty, as well as the political science one, and then went on to study law school there as well. And I specialized in social justice law. So I really kind of pigeonholed myself as very social justice oriented. My family's in Toronto. I live in Ottawa now, and yeah, that's a little bit about me.
So my first question, I guess, is what was it like to study gender studies?
So it's funny. I was originally just in a political science program and with a co-op option, and I took an intro to women's studies course in my first year. And I mean, I come from a relatively conservative background, not capital C, small c. And I am a person of faith. And so I knew going into, a secular university and then taking a women's studies program, I knew that I wouldn't agree with everything that was taught, but I was a pretty feisty young person, and I was interested in politics and law, and those are typically thought of as very male-dominated fields. So I was an outspoken kid. My mouth got me in trouble many times. And so I really identified, I think, as a feminist in a broad concept, with a broad definition of that term. I would have thought of myself as pretty avant-garde. And so I thought that, even if I disagreed with some of the things taught in a women's studies course, surely there would be a number of points of commonality. And that was not my experience, unfortunately. What I found was, I went in knowing that it would be very supportive of abortion and that we might disagree. I might disagree with the teacher and the students on that point. But I thought, this is it's an intro to women's studies course. Surely we're going to talk about first, second, third wave feminism. We're probably going to talk about equal pay. We're going to talk about the right to vote and kind of the history of women's, the women's movement. And that was not my experience at all. I actually don't think we covered any of the history whatsoever. It really, in that course, I think I was told that disagreeing with people is inherently hateful. I was told that Christian celebrations of purity. So in the United States, there are sometimes purity balls, and, you know, in some Christian communities, there are purity rings, this kind of thing, that those are incestuous and quasi-pedophilic. I was told that, you know, sex work is amazing and liberating, and we actually, you know, I think this was probably the straw that broke the camel's back for me, was they brought in a sex shop, like a local sex shop that sells sex toys, to do a workshop with us on female pleasure. So specifically how to pleasure yourself as a woman without a man. And I mean, I actually had a big conflict of conscience even going to that, because I was someone who, you know, I wasn't prudish, but I wanted to, you know, not subject myself to that kind of content, at least not in the context of a mandatory course where this could be examinable material. Like, maybe, you know, they could have provided it as a workshop that was optional for those who were interested. And so this was kind of the introduction I had. And then with the issue of abortion, you know, it wasn't just pro-choice, which is what I assumed it would be. It was like fully pro-abortion. We had a presentation from one of the researchers at the University of Ottawa, a very intelligent woman, who basically, her position was that if we legalized abortion around the world, we would eliminate all maternal health issues, all world hunger, and all global poverty, everything. I'm 17, 18 years old, and I'm thinking that sounds like, you know, solving homelessness by killing all the homeless people. Like, I'm sorry, maybe we disagree on whether it's a human or not, but that's not really a solution. Also, do other countries agree with that? There are many nations that really think of life in a very different way, think of family in a very different way. So this was first year, right? And so I thought, what are they teaching in fourth year if this is what they're teaching in first year? So I actually swapped into the program because I wanted to know what other people were being taught, because it was so far removed from, I think, what my community and what I even expected as someone who was very politically engaged as a young person. I really thought I knew what it would be like, and it was so far past that I thought I really need to know so that I can tell people. Your question was, you know, what was that like? I mean, it was really and truly depressing. Like, I actually fast-tracked my degree and did it in 3 years instead of 4. I took extra courses and studied over the summer because I just wanted to get it done as quickly as possible. You know, they were saying things like, you know, because they are supportive of sex work, and they being the, you know, feminist academics, they're supportive of sex work, then there's not really space to discuss human trafficking. And so they would fully have, you know, guest presenters saying human trafficking doesn't exist. You know, they were just really pushing ideas so far to the extreme that it was really, really disheartening to be sitting in a class being taught that human trafficking doesn't exist.
Lies.
It doesn't
lies.
exist.
Those are lies.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's because it's the ideology, right? So
yeah,
I left, I think, ironically, struggling to call myself a feminist. And really, you know, now if I use that term, I say I'm a traditional feminist, because I think there is something within the feminist movement that really was responding to injustice and is worth preserving. But in terms of where it's gone, it really is heartbreaking. And I think, you know, my position is that I think right now it's completely removed from the lived realities of women on the ground, right? That most women are not, you know, contemplating queer theory. They're not contemplating the works of Judith Butler, you know, at the intersection of feminism and philosophy. They're not, you know, treating abortion like it's the most empowering thing that has ever happened. They don't experience sex work and pornography in their relationships the way that feminist academics talk about it. But it still is what feminism is about. So I think what I learned ultimately was that feminism has become very detached from the lived realities of the women that it said it was going to fight for. And we see this in a number of ways now. But yeah, those were some of the challenges that I had. But I'm happy I did it, Tammy, because I now understand the language, and I can speak to people, you know, even explain my pro-life view to people in a way that is coherent to them, that makes sense, and then we can have a better conversation. So, yeah. But I was, in the midst of this feminism program, and I found myself, the conversations happening in class were never really productive. There wasn't really space to challenge the professor or any of the ideas being put forward.
Wow, I can't imagine how you endured that for so long. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was, I say it was the grace of God, really. Like, I think the Lord drew close to me and kind of kept me sane, and would joke with me from time to time, because it was so hard to process emotionally. So I really bonded with one girl in particular over our shared concern about pornography. I was wearing a shirt that said "Porn Kills Love." It's from an organization in the United States called Fight the New Drug. They really think of pornography as an addiction, and it's as harmful to
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I was wearing that shirt, and she knew the organization, so we bonded. And I actually, I had some productive conversations with my colleagues, but always outside of the classroom, right? Because there wasn't, they would say, Lia, you ask really interesting questions. Like, every time you ask a question in class, we pay attention, because there's always, we know it's going to be something. Because what I would do is I would say, we would be talking about disability, for example, and how we need to combat ableism, and I would agree. But I happen to know that abortion is used to target individuals with disabilities. During my time in university, Iceland announced that it had eradicated Down syndrome because it had systematically diagnosed infants in utero with Down syndrome, and then 100% of women who got that diagnosis aborted. And you have to think, women aren't all the same. So there must have been something about the culture, something about the way that Down syndrome was being talked about in medical terms that resulted in these women thinking this is the best solution. So I would mention that in class, and I would say, we're told that abortion is always good and empowering, but what do we do when it's used to target people on the basis of disability or on the basis of gender? So I would ask these questions and kind of challenge in class, and I would have productive conversations with my colleagues after class. And it was during one of these conversations, actually, that I first thought about that language of pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life, because I was surrounded by people who really thought of abortion as very good, really would have thought of themselves as pro-choice. And I was trying, I think, to identify for them that we actually had a lot of common ground. I knew if I just said I'm pro-life that they would immediately think, oh, you're the other person. You're not someone I can associate with. I know exactly who you are, what you believe. And there would be kind of this chasm between us. But really, one of the things I think I learned in university is that there are actually often we often agree on the problems. What we don't always agree on is the solutions. But, pro-life and pro-choice people look at an unplanned or a crisis pregnancy and say, that's a problem. We look at sexual assault and rape and incest and say, that's a problem, right? We often agree on what the problem is, but then it's the solution that we differ on. So I would, my colleagues would say, okay, well, you seem to have problems with abortion. What do you think? And I would say, well, listen, like I love women. I'm supportive of women. I love the idea of choice. I'm a young woman in the modern day studying, politics. I definitely have thoughts about choices that I want to make, but I also love life. And so I started thinking about this language of being pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life, in part to kind of co-opt the language that the other side uses, the other side being those who are really pro-abortion, because they would use this language of you're anti-woman, you're anti-choice if you're pro-life, which always left me feeling very misunderstood, because I really, truly believe that women are harmed by abortion, that abortion is not the best solution that what society can offer women. I think it's frankly a cop-out that we say, oh, you're in this, you're experiencing poverty, or there was a violence in your relationship. Here's an abortion. This will fix it. But it doesn't end the abuse. It doesn't end the poverty. It doesn't end the crisis-inducing factors that produced the crisis in the pregnancy. So I started kind of pushing back against the language that framed abortion in these very simplistic terms as being pro-choice and anti-choice. So I did that also in part to, almost problematize. It's a word we like to use in feminism. Disrupt this idea that abortion is all about choice. Because the reality is that most of the women in my life who have had abortions did not feel that this was a choice, that they had many other options. They really have used this language when describing their experiences to me as it being the only option they had. My mom actually had an abortion, and she explains that she didn't get the information she wanted. She at no point was told, what was going to happen and what the unborn child was. She actually went, and did the research on her own at 16 years of age, trying to figure it out, but it wasn't an informed decision. It wasn't an empowering thing. And so I think this language of choice, it veils what is actually taking place, which is I think women have faced very concrete problems, and society is unable or unwilling to resolve some of those. Men, frankly, have abandoned women in many cases, or have created violence, and instead of calling them higher, instead of saying, men, maybe you should show up and actually provide for this child that you've helped create. Maybe you should learn to not be violent and abusive. Maybe, instead of calling men higher, women, they came up with their own solution, and that solution was abortion. And so anyway, I'm rambling.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking, right? That's why we're talking, because it's through conversation between men and women, but between all of us, that we can come to a better. That's what free speech is about, right? Is that you can say what you need to say. Your person that you're talking to can say what they want to say, and from there you can, if you're listening, you can find a better place, which is what it's all about. And so when we abandon each other and think that we have only ourselves to depend on, the decisions that we make are less than they could be, right? They're just less than they could be. But these abortion laws now, I don't know how far they've advanced, and I think that it's a disservice to mankind to have gone down this road.
Yeah, in terms of the laws, the law in 1969, abortion was illegal up till 1969. And then in 1969, Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, you know what, we'll allow for abortion when the woman's health is in danger. But health was not really defined, and so it was very broad. It could be mental health, it could be physical health, it could be, a number of things. And what women had to do was there were therapeutic abortion committees at some hospitals, not all, but some. And women would kind of present their case and apply, and they had to have the abortion approved. There were a number of challenges, obviously one being that not all hospitals had a therapeutic abortion committee, but also therapeutic abortion committees, in theory, you could have the same woman with the same situation, and one committee would approve, one wouldn't. So this law was challenged by Henry Morgentaler, and in 1988, the Supreme Court struck down the law, and they said, it's arbitrary. The process is putting delays such that if a woman wants an abortion, it could take much longer, and then the risks increase with time. And so they said, this law is not a good law, but they told Parliament to make a new law. They said the government does have a legitimate interest in protecting the fetus, and so government, make a new law. So there was a law that was discussed, and it made it all the way through the House of Commons, all the way to the Senate, and there was a tie vote in the Senate, and it ultimately didn't pass. And that's in part because it would have allowed some abortion, not all. And so the pro-choice community was upset because it restricted some abortion, and the pro-life community was upset because it allowed for some abortion, and there wasn't any compromise. And so instead of having, some kind of restriction. There just was no law. So in Canada right now, there is a legal vacuum, which means that technically abortion is not criminalized. It's not legalized. It's kind of in this decriminalized state where if you can find a doctor who will provide you an abortion, you can, at any stage, it's allowed. Our law says that human life doesn't begin until the fetus has fully emerged from the birth canal and starts breathing on his or her own. And so what that means is partial birth abortion in the third stage, that's allowed. Actually, there have been cases reported to the RCMP where children have been born alive after a failed abortion attempt in kind of a later term, and have been left to die because they weren't supposed to live. So our law right now is really, we're one of very messy. So a number of people who are supportive of abortion will say, well, no, I mean, there are some restrictions practically. The reality is that abortion access varies across Canada, but in terms of whether it's allowed, it is allowed at any stage. And we're consistent such that if there's a pregnant woman who's murdered, then it's actually not recognize that loss of the child, even if that child was wanted, even if that child could have survived with a C-section, it's not recognized under the law that is a human being whose life has been lost. And so our law is really in a very bad place. We're I think we're the only democratic nation in the world that has this law. My understanding is China has some restrictions that aren't really enforced, and we're not really sure what the laws are in North Korea. So apart from those cases, which aren't really known for their human rights, we're really the only country in the world that has this state. And it's not because there was a comprehensive debate, it's because we just couldn't come up with a compromise at the time. And since then, people act as though now abortion is a right, that it's a charter protected right, which is just not the case. So I think, some of the things that you spoke to, Tammy, really are things that weigh heavily on my heart because, my mom has had an abortion. Many of my friends have and have shared what that experience was like for me. And it wasn't the empowering, utopic experience that women were promised. If you kind of rewind to when abortion really became more socially acceptable, it would have been shortly after the sexual revolution. There's a sudden spike in unexpected and crisis pregnancies. Men are, making love, not war, but also not staying in committed relationships. And so women are desperate and they find a solution that will meet that need for them. And that solution they were promised by, Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood. She was a big proponent of birth control and then became a proponent of abortion which she realized, birth control doesn't always prevent a crisis pregnancy. So you need both, or at least that was the theory. I find it concerning, and I've spoken with some post-feminist academics about this, is that in some ways our focus shifted and we started targeting the wrong things. So the problem really was that women were not supported when they became pregnant, that the men were not there. There wasn't a family unit. There wasn't a strong, committed relationship. There was just this woman who is now experiencing a crisis pregnancy, which is a very scary and weighty thing, especially, many, many years ago when there would have been stigma as well. So this is the experience. And instead of saying, men, you should step up and take responsibility for this child that you've helped create, instead, women were, they found their own solution. And so the focus then shifted from being on, addressing what some post feminist scholars have called the male sexual presumption, this idea of men wanting to have sex many times, not taking responsibility, not engaging in any kind of regulation of their sex drive. Instead of calling men to tame that appetite and be in committed relationships, we said, no, the problem is that women can get pregnant. And so we need birth control. So we need abortion. So we need to control using technology, the female reproductive system. And so now we call that choice and we call that autonomy. And now we have medication abortion. So a woman can order medication and have that shipped to her, and she can have an abortion all on her own in her home. And the male is nowhere in the picture. And that's kind of what feminism now is calling empowerment. But I think, a lot of the language that I tried to use in saying, I'm pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life is that system that we've created where women now are having abortions alone with medication, passing their child and in the bathroom in their apartment. Is that really empowerment? Like, is that what we were aiming for? And where is the man? And why is he not stepping up? And where is society maybe telling the woman, we can, there will be job accommodations, there will be financial support, we will surround you so that you can help raise this child. Like, none of that is in the picture, and it's now just the woman alone going through a harrowing experience, whether it's in an abortion clinic or on her own. And we call that now empowerment. And it really, I think, is a very impoverished understanding of, female liberation and female empowerment. And one of the things, so I now have I'm working on a project, a documentary about men and abortion, because men are kind of ignored entirely. And I think we need to bring them into this conversation for a variety of reasons. But I spoke with, remember I mentioned there was that feminist professor, way back, who gave that presentation to my class. And so I spoke with her about this issue, and I said, my concern is that by framing abortion the way that we have, we've offloaded all the weight onto women. So we say no uterus, no opinion, her body, her choice. But when a man says your body, your choice, what's communicated is your problem, your responsibility. I didn't create this problem. This is you. This is your reproductive system that has the issue right now. And so my concern is that women have now been burdened with the weight of something that we thought would be good. So choice, right? But now it's a burden. And now it's, you have to do it alone. And I asked this professor, and she said, yeah, I do think that we've offloaded all the weight onto women, but that's just the cost of bodily autonomy. And on some level, I thought, well, I mean, at least you're honest, but did you tell women that? Like, were women told that they could have the whole world? They could have successful careers, be CEOs, they could change the world, but they would have to do it entirely on their own. They could not rely on a male partner. They could not rely on society to help them if they became pregnant. It was going to be all on their own. I don't think women were told that. And I think if women were told that, most women I know at least would say, no, that's not my understanding of empowerment.
That's for sure. Yeah. And it's very interesting because now the rate of people getting married is very low. The rate of divorce is very high. And who knows how this began, how this fracturing of the marital bond began, and maybe you know something about that, but I don't know if when women started using birth control, and I know that there was more pregnancies once because promiscuity went up when the birth control pill came in, and promiscuity also is who's responsible for even the act of making love at this point, because if it's all in personal choice, then nobody takes responsibility. And I think that's probably this idea of choice.
I'm not a historian or an academic, but I recently read a brilliant book called The Rights of Women by Erica Bacciocchi. She's a postmodern legal scholar, post-feminist legal scholar, not postmodern, post-feminist legal scholar from the United States, and she tracks the work of Mary Wollstonecraft and her feminist beliefs, and she really traces the history of feminism and how, in many ways, it started off really, really good, identifying many legitimate issues, And then there would be kind of breaking points where there would be differences between women. And some women thought we need to insist that society adapt to the female sexual asymmetry, really. The fact that our bodies can bear children, that comes with different needs for the workplace, that comes with different needs in terms of, public policy. And then there would be other women who would say, no, we need to just adapt. We need to have identical equality. So whatever a man can do, we need to do it as well. And so unfortunately, Erica Baciocchi traces the history of feminist thinking and what kind of unfolded. And she says it really was that latter idea that won, this idea of if a man can do it, I can too, right? So now you think about the female, the ideal female worker is one who doesn't have children, who definitely isn't pregnant, won't get pregnant. And if she does, she'll probably have an abortion because we don't want to have to adapt, right? So Erica actually points out that a lot of the progress that was made for women helped women who didn't have children and women who weren't pregnant, but the employment situation and the different adaptations did not benefit women with children or women who were pregnant the same way. Mothers were kind of left behind, but women who could mirror the independent man who has no obligation, who enters the workforce and can commit entirely to his job, women who mirror that are able to access those spaces. And so in many ways, Erica points out that because feminism lost some of that original foundation, it stopped asking society to accommodate the female sexual reality and reproductive reality, and instead asked women to adapt and kind of control their reproductive system. So I think in terms of divorce, that was one of the things, men could walk away from relationships and it didn't affect them the same way. And so there was a lot of marriage reform that there were differences between feminists, but the ones that ultimately won were those who thought, what, if a man can walk away from a relationship, I should be able to too. If a man can have this in a relationship, I should be able to as well. And that then carried over into children. If a man can walk away from responsibility, if he doesn't have to stay and take care of a child, I want to be able to as well. And what's fascinating though, Tammy, is that now we have almost the same conversation, but inverted, right? So now, over the course of making this documentary about men and abortion, we've looked at the sexual revolution. How did we get here? How did we get to a place where we're not talking about the obvious role of a man in every single pregnancy in the history of abortion, legislation, permitting, promoting, and providing abortion? So we talk about that, and a lot of it is responding to this no uterus, no opinion language. But one of the things that we talk about is this idea now of paper abortion, this idea that if a woman can have an abortion such that she gets to decide whether she incurs legal obligations for a child, should a man not also be able to have, abort his legal obligations? So should he not be able to walk away from child support? And fascinatingly enough, there are some feminists now who are saying, yes, that would be equal. And on some level, again, you respect the consistency, but then you ask, is that the reality you wanted to make? Because now it's almost a race to the bottom of how detached, disengaged, and disinclined to give and sacrifice for the sake of a child. How much of that can we do? How quickly can I walk away from the consequences of my actions? And I really don't think that this is what we set out to create, but it's where we got. And so ultimately in the documentary, which is called Fathers, we kind of have a call to women to make space for men to come into this conversation and not use this language of no uterus, no opinion, which basically forces men to just be female allies and just agree with whatever the dominant female perspective is. But we also call men to step up and to say, don't defer to this language of your body, your choice, therefore your problem, your responsibility. when a woman is facing a crisis pregnancy, she doesn't want to hear, yeah, whatever you want to do. She wants to know that you'll be there, as the man, that you'll step up, you'll actually take responsibility, that you'll provide for her, that you recognize that you helped get into this situation and you'll help resolve it. And so we kind of call for men and women to come together and not just think about who can run away from the child as quickly as possible, but instead think, can we create something beautiful, a healthy relationship where we have healthy communication? Because frankly, I'm not an expert in relationships, but based on the interviews that I did with people, just, everyday individuals, everyone agrees that healthy communication is essential to a relationship. And so that was the one thing that every single person said: healthy communication, that's the key to a healthy relationship. And so healthy communication doesn't look like, one person, the woman, unilaterally making a decision about what's going to happen to the couple's child. It looks like a conversation, and it looks like coming together and negotiating that between the two of you. And while that won't, end abortion, that won't guarantee that abortion, that whatever the decision the couple makes is good, I think it will shift a lot of the isolation and the hyper independence that has come with the phenomenon of abortion, the rise of abortion and birth control. So, yeah. So
in Hungary, we did a lot of traveling on our book tour last year. And when we were in Hungary, we spoke to people from the government, and they were talking to us about their family policy. And they've had a family policy in Hungary for about the last 10 years. And they've made changes to the taxes. They've taken any couple, man and woman, who marry before they're 25, don't pay any income tax until they're 25, to give them a break so that they could start a family if they want to start a family. And once a married woman has a baby, she pays 25% less income tax for the rest of her life, until when she has 4 children, she no longer pays income tax for the rest of her life. And so they have, and the divorce rate has gone down. The divorce rate has gone down. The abortion rate has gone down. And there are more women working in the workforce because when they work, they make more money. So there's incentive for them to work. They also, grandparents, if a grandparent sacrifices their time at work to take care of grandchildren, they have a tax break on their income tax. So it is, over 10 years, their birth rate is stopped going down. So it's going up. It's not going up at a tremendous rate, but it's halting this downward spiral that the rest of the world is experiencing. So, there's hope there. I think there's hope there. And we're hoping to bring best practices everywhere we find best practices in the world to share those and hope that people will come to understand, as you're doing, that it's responsibility, taking responsibility, that makes us into stronger, resilient people, because trouble's coming. Trouble's always coming. People get sick and they die, and you want to be able to be that person who can hold up yourself and the other people around you at that time. And what does that take? That takes practice. That takes a lifelong of practice of taking on responsibility, and instead of getting away free, like a Monopoly card, getting away free card. That just doesn't lead to anywhere good. That's quite a story.
And I know you've spoken with Louise Perry, and she, in her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, she ends by saying, maybe the solution is, an institution where women will be safe and provided for, and there's stability and there's commitment, and I think we call that marriage, and she gets back to that place, and it's funny because, I mean, really, like, that maybe we figured something out over thousands of years. You know, maybe we kind of knew and had already experienced these problems. And I mean, I'm not that old, but I really do feel myself often kind of almost grieving the fact that we've forgotten so much of why society was shaped the way that it was. You know, I often call it historical amnesia. Like, we just forget. We forget so quickly. But there was a reason why society was formed the way that it was, which doesn't mean that it was perfect. But, you know, it's interesting being a lawyer. One of the things that I've noticed, I do a lot of work with the Canadian Bar Association, and there are often conversations about social issues. And so we've had some conversations recently, some of the individual members, about coercive control, you know, abuse in relationships, femicide, this kind of thing. And they are often looking for a solution, you know, and so they often think, okay, the law can be the solution. You know, we're going to add a new criminal code offense, or we're going to add, and on some level, you know, I get it, because we as humans want a solution to the problems that we identify. But on the other hand, I think we've just forgotten that, you know, life is full of suffering. Humans are broken creatures. We do not create utopias. So the fact that we could create something like, you know, or develop and maintain something like marriage and maintain it for so long, like, maybe we figured something that was good. You know, so many aspects of other cultures we've lost, but this has remained pretty stable. You know, the concept of the family being the essential element on which a society is built has remained relatively stable, right? So I think there can be almost an arrogance in the modern day to think that, oh, those foolish people of old who thought traditional marriage, or, you know, thought that families were important to this kind of thing. And then you look at society, and even someone like, you know, Louise Perry, who is a feminist, you know, through and through, who really, you know, is not someone who you'd think of as, you know, kind of a prudish, social conservative person. She really has come to the conclusion that maybe returning to that institution that we abandoned, you know, a few decades ago, maybe that's going to actually help women, and, you know, and maybe we were wrong to abandon it. So my hope is that we get back to that. And I do think that there, like you said, there are some really exciting, hopeful initiatives being undertaken, whether by, you know, you and your husband and the ARC, or whether it's in Hungary, or there are other nations I know as well who really are, I think, trying to not replicate some of the problems that we have here in North America and the West.
I do have hope. You know, all this traveling around that we've done and talking to lots of people. When we went on tour in 2018, mostly it was men that came to the lectures, and they were hurting. They were not in a good place. They weren't feeling like their life was going in the direction that they had hoped it would be going. And this time when we toured, the men were they were better dressed. They usually came with a partner, and their stories were always, you know, I was in a rough place. I read your books, or I watched your videos, and I thought about what I could do, and I took on that challenge, and now I'm in a much better place, and I'm also shouldering responsibility, and I have a community that I'm caring for, and so I'm much more hopeful. And the crowds are bigger than they were, so there's more people coming, and they're looking better. So I do think that the message of responsibility is catching on, and I think that, you know, I think that this whole experiment that we've had, this feminist experiment, because it has been definitely an experiment, there's many avenues, like the birth control pill, that we've never really talked about the harm we have, but not enough, the harmful effects of hormones. And now, of course, we're giving hormones as an answer to gender dysphoria, or even being uncomfortable in your skin as a 13-year-old girl, that an answer would be to change your gender and take hormones. But these hormones, they are disruptive, and they will change you, and they're a dramatic change that we haven't talked about enough. And so feminism has lots to do. We have lots to do. We have lots of things we could talk about, and lots of issues that we could take under a microscope and really pay attention to and discuss. But we have to become humble. We have to realize that we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing, and we have a lot to learn. And we've made mistakes. And like you said, we suffer, and we're going to suffer. We do suffer. And this is our plight. And it's through suffering that you learn. So there's no getaway scot-free in this life. So, yeah, this is all very fascinating and definitely needs more talking. So you wrote a book. You wrote a book based on your experiences that started at 12 years old, right? 12 years old. I watched your video of you when you were 12 years old. You were absolutely adorable and so articulate, man. I mean, and then, of course, I read further along about, your making a video and being in school, and there was a competition for who was going to write the best article, and maybe you could just tell people just a little bit about that time, and then I think we'll move forward.
Yeah. So when I was 12, I was in a public school in Toronto. I was in grade 7, and there was an English English class project in school that we had to write a 5-minute speech about anything we wanted. And then you had to memorize it and present it to the class, and it's kind of a public speaking initiative. I'm assuming that other people had this project. I was in the gifted program at the time, but it seemed to be pretty common. Everyone seemed to do it. The whole school was competing in it. So there was the project, and there was a competition. It was named the Agnes MacPhail Speech Contest, and Agnes MacPhail being one of the first female, if not the first female member of parliament in Canada. So again, that political motivation, I really wanted to win that competition. I often joke, you could tell that I wasn't a very sporty kid, because here I was dreaming about winning the speech competition. So I was that kind of kid, So I really wanted to win, but I also was a very indecisive kid. And so when the teacher says you can write about literally anything, it's a lot of options, right? So I had been raised to believe that God knows everything, that, he knows what's going to happen in the future. And so at the ripe old age of 12, I deduce that if God knows everything, that he knows what topic is going to win this competition. And he knows, that I want to win. And so I didn't ask for the winning topic. That felt too insincere a prayer. I mean, come on. But he knew the desires of my heart. And so here I am, 12 years old, thinking that I can pull a fast one on the Lord. And so I'm praying, and I say, God, what topic should I write about? And I should say it was about probably 6 months or so before that I really had gotten serious about my faith. I had been raised in a Christian home, but it can kind of be just how you're raised. But when I was about 11, I struggled shifting from homeschool to public school, which I did in grade 4. And I had tried to fit in and tried to kind of compromise, and it wasn't working. And I just concluded, know what? I'm going to be different, and that's fine. And if I'm going to do this Christianity thing, I want to do it 100%. Why would you do anything else? And so I had been praying for the Lord to break my heart for the things that broke his. Like, I really wanted to understand the Lord and what he cared about. And so anyway, that was the background context. So I'm praying here, trying to win this speech competition and get God to tell me the winning topic. And he suggests the topic of abortion. Now, I was raised, like I said, in a Christian home, but I wasn't raised in a pro-life home. As I've mentioned, my parents had an abortion, and I suspect that, was hard for them. So they didn't talk about the issue. I think we'd maybe gone to a prayer initiative where that issue had been raised before. But I was not, I didn't go to the March for Life. I didn't go to a Catholic school, so I wasn't hearing regular presentations on the issue of abortion. really had very little understanding. And so I kind of naively, thinking this might be the winning topic, say, yes, wonderful, and start, doing some research. And that's when I found out what abortion is, and, that there are about 100,000 abortions in Canada every year, that this is allowed in Canada. And I was, again, very opinionated, feisty 12-year-old. I'd been raised to believe that, that Canada was a good nation that fought for human rights. That was what we were taught. I had studied issues in school in the gifted program about child slavery and child soldiers. Like, I had a sense about justice and injustice. And here I am finding out that there are, from a 12-year-old's perspective, there's a baby. The baby is being killed, and killing babies is wrong. Like, that was kind of the extent of the understanding I felt I needed to conclude that abortion was clearly a problem. And so I went to my teacher and said, this is the topic I want to write about. And it was a public school in Toronto. So you can imagine what that was like. So she told me, you can't do that issue. That topic is too big, too mature, way too controversial. That's a no. But being sassy 12-year-old that I was, I pulled up the school assignment that had said we could write about any issue. And I kind of slid it across her desk, and said, well, I do believe you said we could write about anything, and this is one of anything. And so she'd been my teacher for a couple of years, and she knew what I was like. So she conceded and said, okay, fine, you can write it for the project, but you'll automatically be disqualified from the competition. Which was really hard for me because A, that was unjust, but B, I also really wanted to win. And so it was, I really had to decide what mattered more to me. And I would love to tell you, Tammy, that I was, that I was like, oh, that's okay. Whatever the Lord wants, I will follow his lead, but I was 12. I was selfish, I wanted to win. And so I wrestled with this decision for weeks, and every adult in my life thought this was a very dumb idea. My parents didn't understand. I was a people pleaser, so they just thought I would change the topic to make my teacher happy when I didn't. They just, couldn't understand my passion for this issue. We would have come from a Christian community that really thought of the gospel, preaching the gospel is the only important thing. Everything else was secondary. And here I was really disagreeing and saying that this issue really mattered to God. And then my librarian was sending me home with different topic ideas. My teacher was trying to help me find new topics. And I remember being on the bus, the TTC, on the way to school, and on the day I had to decide, and just knowing kind of with a sinking feeling in my heart that I couldn't do it. Like, I couldn't not write about the issue because I really felt like God had brought it to my attention. He wouldn't have done it if he didn't care about it. And it almost felt like it would be betrayal for me to just move on and just say, yeah, God, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something that I want to do. And so I forfeited I kind of preemptively forfeited the competition. I wrote the speech. And my parents weren't really able to help with the content, obviously, because it was a school project. So my teacher gave me some guidance. And I think my mom recommended that I predict people's questions before they ask them, similar to kind of what Paul does in the book of Romans. So I had that guidance, and I wrote my speech and presented it. And my teacher, being, honestly, a really good educator, put me back in the competition because she said, you did such a good job. It's only fair. And then I was disqualified because I referenced the Creator, and that was just too Christian for a public school. And so there was kind of this back and forth. There was a judge I won at the school, at the class level, and then went on to the school level. But then there was a judge who didn't want to hear it. He stepped down and refused to listen. I technically won, and then they reported someone else had won. So it was like kind of drama and, conspiracies. It was quite dramatic. And here I am, 12 years old, just rolling my eyes, being like, adults are so complicated, Anyway, in the end, I made it all the way to the regional levels, but I didn't win. But while all that was happening, my parents, who again, initially opposed, but really felt that I had done a good job and were proud of me, wanted to show some friends. So they took a video. It took us 3 days to get this one video because we didn't know how to do video editing or anything like that. And we get the video, we post it online. I think we used my brother's YouTube account, which was named after a Pokemon. Like, this was not, a high class quality production. But anyway, so we put it up, and my parents would kind of keep me updated on how many views there were, and then it went from maybe 25 to 100 to 1,000, and then 10,000, and we started getting really confused at that point because we'd sent it to a few friends, and we'd sent it to one of the organizations I'd used some research from. That was it, right? And so, but the views just kept going up and really exploded. And so to this day, there are almost 3 million people who have seen the video, the original video. There have been other duplicates that have been made. That it kind of spiked to 1.6 million, I think, and then re-spiked again when I was 16. And I think part of it was there was a lot of controversy in the United States at the time. I didn't know, but there was, I think Obama was being elected. He was very supportive of abortion. So this was a very live issue. But that ultimately, all these people see this video, and then we started getting comments. And a lot of the comments, we had some that were very positive, people saying, it's good that you're standing up for what you believe in, even if they disagreed with me, people saying you're cute, this kind of thing. And then we had a lot of negative comments. So I didn't manage the comments. I was 12. My mom was kind of suddenly inundated with these notifications. And so there were a lot of people who were saying, we're going to find you and kill you. You should have been aborted. You should be raped, specifically by your father. Just really awful things that no one should ever hear, but especially a 12-year-old. And my parents didn't want to shield me from that. They wanted me to know. And so I really think of when I was 12 was kind of the moment I stopped being a people pleaser, because I realized that I couldn't make everyone happy. But that ultimately, we struggled with the video, what to do. We took it down for a period, but then put it back up. But I went by a pseudonym for most of my life. So my full name is Garifalia Milousis. I'm very Greek. I go by Lia, but I instead of using my real last name, because there are only a few families in Canada with that name, they're all related to me. We went with the name Lia Mills for a long time. So it was only actually after law school that I merged the two identities and kind of said this is all the same person, which I'm sure many people knew already, but yeah, it was to shield me. And there was actually a point where people figured out when I was 14 what my name was, posted it on online. They kind of, maybe before doxing became a thing, they did that, and I became very afraid. I started memorizing license plates of cars that were parked beside. Keeping track of where people were, who was behind me when I walked home from school. Just, there was a lot of fear because I knew there were a lot of people who were really upset. So my family ultimately moved. So it was quite an experience, definitely atypical. I often say I made many videos after that, but none of them went viral the way that one did. And I really think the Lord had something specific he wanted to do with that one. And I can't imagine what my life would be like without that, because it was that ultimately got me interested in politics, which got me to university, which got me to law school, which got me to where I am today. So
pivotal. Huh? Wow. Yeah. 12 years old. Man, oh man. But people think a 12-year-old is a child, and in a way is a child, but is also old enough to get involved with deep issues. And that's another thing about responsibility and being responsible. You were responsible at 12 years old for free speech, for what you wanted to say, and you needed to say it, and it has been a guiding light ever since. Very, very,
and
very
people often, people would tell me at the time, you'll grow out of this, or, this is just what your parents are telling you to say, or,
and it wasn't.
Well, it wasn't. It really, really wasn't. But it was interesting because a lot of people would say you should just do normal kid things, normal teenage things. And I remember thinking what, have sex and do drugs? What do you, what's normal? This is my normal. This is really important to me. And I think this is a good thing. And I mean, the reality is that 12-year-olds can have abortions in Canada. The concept of a mature minor, you know, you don't need your parents' consent to have an abortion. So if I'm old enough to make that decision, frankly, like I really think that a 12-year-old is old enough to understand the key concepts. And I should say, you know, I've learned a lot since then. There are a lot of complexities, especially when you get into, you know, there being sexual assaults and the life of the mother. And there are lots of really kind of nuanced aspects of this issue. But the crux of it is simple in the mind of a child. And I think we can complicate it as adults. So it was that confusion, all these people saying your parents made you do it, all of this that ultimately led to me writing my book. I wanted to kind of have a clear record and set the record straight, you know, and so I chuckled because I wrote it when I was 19 and it's semi-autobiographical. So like, here's all my wisdom at the age of 19, you know, it's a little silly, but I wrote it and then I included a bunch of the things I'd learned, you know, so how do you respond to the question of what about abortion in the case of rape or in the case of an ectopic pregnancy or these really hard case categories. I try to condense a response and provide the research, the things that I had learned. I provided a lot of my thoughts about being pro-woman, pro-choice, pro-life, and put it all in there just to show in part kind of the arc of my own grappling with this issue, but also hopefully to equip people, because there are some pro-life people, you know, who don't explain their worldview in a helpful way or a particularly productive way. And so I was really trying to kind of equip, especially the young people, you know, people my age and younger, to articulate themselves in a way that that is clear, that is winsome, but is consistent. Because I think sometimes people come across a question that they can't answer and they become scared and they think, well, maybe everything I believed is wrong. And the reality is that you can, like I said, you can love women and care about women and have answers to these hard case categories, but still stand firm on the belief that it is always wrong to end another human life, period. And that really is what informs my position on abortion. It's why I don't support capital punishment. And it also informs my belief on euthanasia and assisted suicide, which I know we wanted to touch on, but it's that consistent worldview, like, you know, a pro-life ethic isn't just anti-abortion. It's actually saying life is inherently valuable. It's the, you know, the sanctity of human life. It's a legal principle. There is something inherent and valuable and meaningful in a human life that makes it always wrong to end, whether, you know, the government does it, whether a mother does it, even out of desperation, whether a doctor does it. It's always wrong for another person to take that human life, because obviously I believe it's made in the image of God and is therefore inherently valuable, but even secular society recognizes there's something special about humans. It makes them different. And we protect human life all the time and have for millennia. So yeah, it's that inherent pro-life worldview that I try to kind of equip people to articulate in my book.
And assisted suicide then, because that is going, well, it's being brought up in Canada in a big way. And the more conversations we have about this right now are necessary. So maybe you could just inform us about where we stand right now. And I know that maybe it's different in different provinces, but just kind of bring us up to date.
Yeah, so maybe a quick crash course. So in 1993, there was a court case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where there was a woman, Sue Rodriguez. She was in her mid to late 40s. She had ALS, so her muscles were really deteriorating. Her condition was really deteriorating, and she was experiencing a lot of pain and suffering. And she challenged the provision of the criminal code that said that made it a crime for someone to assist another person or counsel another person to commit suicide. She said, so it's important to understand Sue Rodriguez was able to kill herself. She could have starved herself to death. She could have, put herself in a precarious situation in her wheelchair. But obviously, those are forms of suicide that are very gruesome. All suicide is tragic, but they were particularly violent ways of ending life, or painful ways of ending life. So her protest was that it was unfair that she couldn't have a doctor assist her. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the criminal code prohibition and said that assisted suicide was not permitted, could not be justified, and for a variety of reasons, a number of them being the sanctity of human life, the dangers that come with government essentially sanctioning some suicides and saying some are okay, some are not. The fact that it would allow a third party to kill another human being, that has always been something we've understood as bad. There have been exceptions historically, but in Canada, we don't have those. We don't have capital punishment, right? So there were a lot of concerns. And so we said no to assisted suicide in 1993. In 2015 was the Carter decision, also at the Supreme Court. And it was similarly a woman who could have ended her own life. There were a number of plaintiffs involved, but essentially, these were individuals who could have ended their lives, but the options available to them were not the ones that they wanted. And so they wanted to have a third party assist their suicide. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court essentially said that individuals were forced to kind of end their lives prematurely with a way that they liked when they were still able to do it, or die in pain and suffering, and that was a cruel choice. And so they said, when you're dealing with an individual who's over the age of 18, is consenting to this voluntarily, has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, they're getting worse with time, it's not going to get better, and they're in intolerable pain and suffering, according to them, subjectively, that such a person should be able to end their own life. So that's really when things shifted in Canada, as 2015. There was a year to implement that. So in 2016 is when we started seeing euthanasia. And what occurred, so it's important to understand, again, quickly, the Carter decision, if you paid attention to the language, it often used the idea of physician-assisted suicide and hastening death interchangeably. The idea was that this was going to be a very small number of people. In fact, the court actually used the language of this being an almost complete prohibition, that almost all forms of euthanasia and assisted suicide would be prohibited. It would be a very small exception. That was what they were envisioning. So it used the language of hastening death. And so, again, there was this understanding, although it wasn't articulated in as many words, that we were talking about people at the end of their lives, people who, it's the final few days, final few weeks, maybe final few months, and we're hastening a death that has already really begun. I mean, all of us are dying, but really begun in an active way. That decline has started, and we're just speeding it up. I still take issue with that, but that's just the context, okay? So then there were inevitably some individuals. So the context is the Supreme Court makes this decision, the federal government enacts Bill C-14 that follows the Carter decision, but implements this requirement that the end of life be near, be reasonably foreseeable. Then there are some individuals in Quebec, Jean Truchon, Nicole Bradieu, who come along and they say, well, we meet all the criteria, but our death is not reasonably foreseeable. So Jean Truchon had cerebral palsy. He was not going to die. He could live for, decades more in theory, but he wanted to end his life. And Nicole Bradieu similarly could live for a long time, but her condition was also one that she found intolerable. And so the lower court in Quebec ultimately said that the reasonable foreseeability of death requirement in Bill C-14 was unconstitutional, that it violated the charter. And then the federal government didn't appeal that decision. So instead of appealing it all the way up to the Supreme Court and getting a sense of what the Supreme Court thought, or referring it even, there's a way that in law that you can refer a question to the Supreme Court and get some thoughts from, some of the brightest legal minds in the country. Instead of doing that, they just said, well, The court in Quebec, this one court, said we had to change the law, so we're going to change the law. I think the way that I'm saying it kind of suggests that I think that maybe this was politically motivated and not motivated really by a comprehensive commitment to understanding what is and is not constitutional, what should and should not be allowed. But I think I think the government rather almost liked the idea that it had a scapegoat, that it could say, the court made us do it. It wasn't us. We had to. So there was a big rush, a huge push to get things changed quickly because this court in Quebec said that was what we had to do. So then they put forward Bill C7, and that would have removed the reasonable foreseeability of death requirement. The reason it's important, all of this is important, is because by removing the reasonable foreseeability of death requirement, there are now a lot of other individuals who qualify for euthanasia and assisted suicide, if that's the only thing you do, including people who have mental illness as the only condition, the only underlying medical condition. So the government said, no, we're not going to allow MAID, medical assistance in dying is what we now started calling it, MAID. We're not going to allow MAID for mentally ill individuals. We're just, it's going to be the same, but we're just removing that reasonable foreseeability of death requirement. There were a lot of concerns with that. One of them being removing that end of life requirement basically meant that every single person over the age of 18 who has a disability, if they say that they're experiencing pain and suffering that's intolerable, qualifies. Because just by existing as a person with a disability, you meet some of the criteria. So there were a number of people who said, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And in part because the law doesn't require the pain and suffering to be connected to the medical issue. So there could be people who are experiencing discrimination, people who are experiencing stigma, ableism, and or some of the other, they're experiencing poverty as a disabled person, whatever it may be. And they conclude for that reason that they want to end their lives. That is what we've historically called suicide, but now we're calling it MAID, right? So there were a lot of people who were concerned about the way that this opened up the doors to almost kind of by default make eligible individuals who just live day to day with a disability, which is a lot of Canadian individuals. So now we're not talking about a small percentage, we're talking about a bigger percentage. And then at the 11th hour, just to make things particularly problematic, the government came along, actually it was the Senate, who said, no, what we need to include mentally ill people, because if we don't, it's going to be discriminatory. I can get into why I think that was a problematic legal analysis. It hasn't been run through the courts, so we still have to see, I guess, what the courts will say. But essentially, then they said, okay, know what? We're going to allow mentally ill individuals. So individuals whose only underlying medical condition is they have an eating disorder or an anxiety disorder or bipolar or depression. These individuals could now qualify for medical assistance in dying. But they said that will take place in 2 years. We'll give some time for people to, for the medical community to adapt. I won't go into all the reasons why that was problematic. One of them is that they didn't get expert evidence on that issue for most of the time they were doing this consultation, because that it wasn't going to be for mentally ill individuals. It was just going to be for other physical disabilities. So there was that. There's the fact that there isn't consensus in the medical community about whether and when a mental illness can become irremediable. I mean, frankly, I've experienced depression myself. It's hard to, in the moment, it feels like it's going to last forever. Right. But then it doesn't, you know what I mean? And even treatment-resistant depression, it will sometimes go away spontaneously. And there have been papers about this. So the medical community did not have consensus about whether it was even possible to determine conclusively that a mental illness was irremediable, which meant that if you could find a doctor who said that it was, then you could qualify, right, even if other people generally really believed and there was no evidence to support that conclusion, right? So there were a lot of problems with this. So this is kind of where we're at right now. So Bill C7 unfortunately passed. So now in Canada, there are 2 tracks for MAID in Canada. So And I should say MAID encompasses both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And for those who are curious, physician-assisted suicide is where the doctor provides the means or the information, but doesn't actually end the life him or herself. Euthanasia is essentially the same, but the doctor actually does the killing, the act that ends the life. It's important to understand in Canada, we have both that are legalized, but the vast majority, and by vast majority, I mean, out of 10,000, in 2021, I believe there were approximately 10,000 people, just over, who ended their lives through euthanasia. And I think just a handful, maybe less than 10, did it themselves, engaged in physician-assisted suicide. Everyone opts for euthanasia. And there are reasons for that. I think having a doctor do it adds a sense of legitimacy. I think it makes, frankly, the act of suicide easier when someone else does it for you. But that's a separate conversation maybe after. So this is where we're at in Canada. We have euthanasia and assisted suicide. If your death is reasonably foreseeable, then you can access it the day of your approval. The 10-day waiting period that was required before is not there anymore. We also don't need to ask you, just as the doctor is about to end your life, doesn't need to ask you to confirm that this is in fact what you want. That's called contemporaneous consent. That was also removed. So there's a way to waive it. So this is one track. And then the second track is where your death is not reasonably foreseeable. And this one comes with a 90-day waiting period, which sounds like a long time. It's approximately 3 months, but the reality is that you often can't get treatment for many of these conditions for months and months and months, sometimes years, right? So it actually isn't that long in terms of thinking that there might be an individual who hasn't obtained some form of treatment that they want or need. The question of treatment is also a big concern. In Canada, you need to be told about treatment options that are available to you other than euthanasia and assisted suicide, but they don't have to actually be practically available to you. So, we have to be able to tell people about palliative care, but maybe the palliative care doesn't exist in that community, or isn't funded in that community, or, isn't practically accessible. So there's that, and the patient doesn't have to try the method, which means now when you think about mental illness, you could have individuals who have, an anxiety disorder or have depression, who are told about treatment options, but they don't have to access them. They don't have to have exhausted other forms of treatment. They just have to be told about them. And then, of course, in that 90-day waiting period, there's not the time to access them, right? So if that person, gets through that 90 days, they can now end their lives. So there are many, many issues with this. And I think, it's just been kind of one issue after another. Right now in Canada, so those are the two tracks. We don't have euthanasia for mental illness as the only underlying medical condition yet. That has been delayed an extra year. So now it will be March 17th, 2024 is when that will start being permitted. There is still not consensus in the medical community. There are a lot of individuals who have pushed firmly back against this. And it's really, really, really unfortunate. The reality is, Tammy, there was a moment actually in the midst of COVID when I sat down and I looked at the numbers, because right now in Canada, there are over 30,000 people who have access to euthanasia and assisted suicide. So in some provinces, in some communities, the death rate has been between 5 and 7% are main deaths. I think in Canada, across the country, it's about 3.5%. Our laws are some of the most progressive, well beyond countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, where they have had euthanasia maybe slowly expand over 20, 25 years. We've not even had it I think we've had it for 7 or 8 years now, and we're already way beyond them, in part because of all these things I've said. We don't need to have treatment. Pain and suffering is also defined subjectively, which means that if I present myself to a doctor and say, this is what I'm experiencing, the doctor doesn't have to agree. The doctor doesn't have to evaluate me as to whether I'm actually experiencing pain and suffering at that level. The doctor just says, okay, that's what you're telling me, because it's subjective. Whereas in other countries, there is a requirement that that the patient feel this way and the doctor agree that they are experiencing intolerable pain and suffering. So there are a number of things that make Canada's laws extremely progressive. The most permissive euthanasia and assisted suicide regime in the world. And now we're about to expand it to folks with mental illness in a context where there is still, some of the Indigenous communities we have the highest suicide rates among youth in the world. I believe that's Inuit youth have some of the highest suicide rates. We continue to know that that mental illness and suicidality are connected. And people have said since euthanasia has been on the table, like, no, it's not suicide, it's not suicide, it's not suicide. And it's only recently, actually, that people have started acknowledging, know what, it is. It is, in fact, suicide, but some are allowed. And so we've basically gotten to what the Supreme Court way back in 1993 was worried about, where we have the government essentially saying some lives are valuable and worth living, and those lives will get suicide prevention and treatment, and some lives are not really worth living. They're not as valuable, whether they're disabled, whether they're experiencing pain and suffering, whether they're elderly, and we don't see utility, they're not productive, they're not contributing to society the way that they used to. And so those are individuals who could access euthanasia and assisted suicide. And so I remember researching euthanasia when I was 13 actually, and I really thought that this was a very far off thing that would never happen. And now I'm 26, almost 27, and it's something that is happening all around us, tens of thousands of people. And as I was starting to say, there was a moment in the midst of COVID where I thought, I wonder how many people have died from COVID versus from euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I looked up the numbers, and at the time, it was about 20 to 21,000 for both. Now, I recognize that the euthanasia deaths have happened over a longer period of time than COVID. It's not, listen, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, okay? But I just noticed this similarity, and I thought, how is it possible that on the one hand, we're shutting down the borders, shutting down the economy, doing everything possible to keep people alive, and then on the other hand, we're killing people intentionally in these same hospitals? How does that make any sense? And the only conclusion I can come to, I don't know if you have insights, Tammy, is that it's really about sovereignty. It's about choice. Again, it's about this idea of I get to decide when I die, how I die. I have control over it. This is inevitable. I'm going to die. And if I'm going to accept that reality, then I'm only going to accept it on my terms. So if a disease is going to come and try to take my life, I'm going to resist. And I'm going to say, nope, this isn't what I want. But if I'm experiencing pain and suffering, I'm going to say, no, what, this is how I want to die. I get to choose when I die, who kills me, where I die, who's around me, when I die. Like, I get to choose everything. And I think on some level, we, again, have believed this lie that choice is the ultimate human virtue, that me getting to make a choice is the most important thing about me. Forgetting that maybe there's something inherently valuable in your life, even if you can't work the way you used to, even if you are experiencing suffering. Forgetting that that choice when we can then control other people, when you get to dictate to a doctor, the question of conscience rights, it's a whole other conversation. You get to now dictate to a doctor, to a society, that they have to adapt their laws so that you can die on your own terms. The idea of, many people now who are choosing euthanasia at this point in time, they're, your upper echelons of society. They're generally white, wealthy, well-educated. These are upper class individuals who are used to having independence and cannot conceive of life being meaningful without choice, without functionality. And those who are resisting euthanasia are ironically those who have had to depend on others, those who are disabled, those, who have struggled with mental health issues, who are saying, no, our lives matter, even if we're not fully independent, even if we have to be interdependent, rely on other people, our lives still matter. And they're pushing against euthanasia because they know that the shift from something becoming a right to becoming an obligation is very quick. And so, we started talking about this issue as something that some, a small section of people could do when they want in very regulated terms. The Supreme Court in the Carter decision actually used the language of stringent limitations that are scrupulously monitored and enforced. Like, really thought that this would be highly regulated. And now we have 10,000 euthanasia deaths, a year more than that. We have really concerning stories of disabled people being approved because of socioeconomic issues. And so, again, it wasn't the utopia we were promised. And I think we started aiming at the wrong thing and started thinking that choice is what's going to fix everything, when really the solution to suffering is meaning. You think about Viktor Frankl, who said, suffering without meaning is despair. That's kind of his proposition, and he's right. I think those who can find meaning in suffering, or create that meaning, or are told at the very least that their life is still valuable and meaningful despite the suffering, those are the ones who don't despair. But those who don't have that, often individuals who don't have that kind of spiritual foundation or don't hear that message from society, those are the ones who really suffer and they despair. And that's why I think we have so much euthanasia these days. It's a lack of hope in the midst.
My thought on this is when I was really sick, I've done many videos about this, but when the doctor told me that I had 10 months to live when I was sick with cancer, my first thought was, my mother died. She wasn't very young, but younger than we thought she would. So did her sister, so did my uncle. Maybe I'm also one of those people. So I just accepted his prognosis. I went home to tell my son, and when I told him and I saw the grief in his eyes reflected back to me, his love for me, I realized that he had more love for me than I had for myself, and that I was worthy, more worthy than I thought I was, because there was someone in my life who wanted me alive and who cherished his mother. And a mother and child is an amazing relationship that way. And I could feel the weight of the world lift off my shoulders, because at that moment, I would say that the Holy Spirit came to me at that moment, and I realized then that the doctor has an opinion about what might happen to me, and it's an informed opinion, but it's still an opinion. It's still, there's a relationship between what I have and the probability that I'll die. For certain, there is a relationship there, but ultimately it's up to God whether I live or die. There's no one else who has that knowledge. And in the midterm, between the time that I am alive and I'll die, I'll accept whatever help comes my way with grace and gratitude, and that was a gift that was given to me only through meditation, through pausing, through waiting and discovering what is best, but not for me to make a decision. It wasn't up to me to make the decision, and especially momentarily, like that quickly, without any time and reflection and conversation and all these things that we can partake in to find what the next right step is. And Carl Jung talked about the next right step, that it's really important to limit ourselves to the next right step, and to know that we only go one step at a time, but each step has to be with a conscious step. And I think, our belief in marriage, our understanding of the institution of marriage and everything that we've talked about have been an acceptance, but not a conscious acceptance. And so what we're doing now, I think, through these conversations and through people, very smart people who are thinking these things through and writing them down and sharing their information with us, is to think these things through and to make conscious decisions about how we're going to reflect on our suffering and make our decisions that way, instead of just thinking that we even have enough knowledge to make those decisions. They're huge decisions. And to think that I would understand how I would come to that decision and that it would be the right decision with my understanding, that's there's a lot of ego in that. And well, I've learned over and over again, and I'm sure I'll learn again more and more through my life, that it's not up to me. It's definitely not up to me. It's up to me to listen. It's up to me to learn. It's up to me to ask questions. And if we could listen more, learn from what we listen, and ask questions so that we can learn more, then, life can give you answers in ways you have no idea. We have no idea what tomorrow could be like. And so making a decision today with certainty, you got to be real careful with that. And, by the grace of God, we go, right?
I love that, the way that you put that, Tam, like we don't know what tomorrow might bring, right? I after in the midst of Bill C7 being discussed, I had done a bunch of legal work on this. I had, written to the government, legal submissions, and all of these things. And there came a point where it just looked like it was going to happen no matter what. And the only thing I had left was to share my own story. And so I made this video called Tell Me to Stay. The background actually is I wrote a 3-page letter outlining my story and emailed it individually to every member of parliament, every senator, just begging them, like, please understand that the decision you're making has a real impact on real human beings, individuals like me who I experienced an intense, awful period of depression without explanation. There wasn't a set trigger. I wasn't sexually assaulted. There wasn't any kind of big moment, which was really hard for me because it felt like it was this amorphous depression and suffering that just descended on me, and I didn't know how to fix it. And it was this period of about 2 intense years. I struggled with an eating disorder, with self-harm. I attempted suicide 7 times. And then I made a decision. I thought, if I keep on this road, like, I'm actually going to succeed. And that's not actually what I want. I just want this suffering to end. So I kind of plowed ahead and ultimately went to university, but continued battling for many years. And I shared this story though, because now I'm a lawyer, I'm Lord willing, planning on getting married soon. And just my life has been beautiful. There has been, but there has also still been hardship. It wasn't like the negotiation God and I made was, okay, I'm going to get better and then nothing bad is going to happen to me. There is still suffering. So I did experience like sexual assault and abuse after. I did experience immense loss, all after that depression. And what got me through was not the promise that life is going to be pain-free and that there's not going to be suffering, and that it's going to end like the next season is going to be perfect. It was just recognizing that even in the midst of pain and suffering, there is still hope and there is still beauty. And I think that's kind of the antidote to this. I look at society right now and I feel like the proverbial demons of despair and depression and destruction that came after me are now coming after society. And I sometimes say, I just finished walking back from the proverbial ledge and now society's barreling off of it. And I'm like, stop, just like it's not, it does get better. And it's not perfect, but instead of choosing, if you finally come to a point where you realize suffering is inevitable, instead of choosing to give into that and say, okay, therefore I'm going to embrace it and give myself to it and die, and calling that empowerment, choose to hold on to hope, because that is the harder thing. Hope is a very painful thing to hold on to, because it isn't, life isn't always, it doesn't work out the way that you thought it would. And there are moments where you're disappointed and you're let down. But actually in one of those kind of seasons of struggle and processing intense, painful loss, almost the loss of the hope that I had found, the thing that I had invested my hope into, I wrote another poem all about, my frustration with hope as a concept. And I wrote, I'll just read the last little bit. I wrote, "The path before you and me may be lonely, but the promise of hope is not found in a light that is pain-free, but rather in the guarantee that through every season we will always see beauty and tragedy, but then unity and humanity, addiction and desperation, but then redemption and restoration, suffering and sorrow, but then the promise of a new tomorrow, the sunrise, new life, and the opening of your lover's eyes. Hope will give you ears to hear and eyes to see, a perpetual luminosity to light your way. So please listen and believe me when I say stay. Life really does get better." And that was all associated with this imagery of light, hope being this candle that we hold. And if you hold it long enough, it will burn you, right? It will hurt to continue holding that, but it will also light the way ahead of you. And I think that's the solution we need. And I do have a lot of hope, because I feel like the church can have an answer. We know about suffering, and we follow the son of suffering, and there is something, I think there's an opportunity for the church to step in and say there is hope. And so in the midst of, speaking of hope, I don't know if the laws are going to change, when they're going to change. I really believe that they will one day. And I really believe that people will see how bad things got. I just wish it didn't cost so many lives. But my hope and my prayer is that, until that change comes, until society realizes what it has done and walks back from that edge, that, each one of us will draw closer to those who are suffering, whether mentally or physically. We'll speak messages of life and meaning and value, and holiness and hope into those who we can speak into, those in our sphere of influence, and that that the crisis that our society is experiencing right now will cause us to kind of wake up and be the solution for those people in our lives, instead of relying on the government to do it. That we'll step up and say, even if the government is giving you a message of hopelessness and saying your life doesn't have meanings, your life is meaningful. There is value, there is hope. Stay. Life really does get better. So that's the hope that I have. And sounds like you have too. So we'll keep hoping.
I do. Together. I have hope. My son and daughter-in-law have just arrived. They have 2 little kids. If I had decided that I wanted to end my life, I wouldn't be here to see this. The glory of this new life coming up. These new, they're just so excited about life, and they just want to learn everything they can. And right now, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful, and here I get to enjoy that. I'm so grateful, and I just hope for these conversations to be had between all of us, so that we can see that it isn't up to the government to save us. It's up to each of us to offer our whatever we can do to be helpful, and to bring each other to a better place. It's something that could just make everything good again. Thank you. This was a lovely conversation. Deep, troublesome topics, but what can you do?
We have to work through it, right? It can be easy to want to avoid these things, but but working through them, like you said, that discussing and wrestling and grappling and coming together as 2 human beings who are flawed, but really seeking to leave the world better than we found it. I think there's really a lot of beauty in that. So thank you for what you shared, and for what I've learned from you, and for what you do, because I know that you are fostering this, and it does make a difference. It's hard to know, hard to see sometimes what
right.
exactly that is, but we know that it does. Right?
Well, thank you very much, because I think people will, they'll have more understanding now, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
And thank you for having me, Tammy. Thank you. Thank you.